This week on Jerusalem Dateline, a new administration takes over in Washington. What will it mean for Israel? CBN News sat down with former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, to discuss the achievements of the Trump administration in the Middle East. And he looks ahead to what the new administration needs to avoid. And Casa al-Yahud, the churches on the Jordan River celebrate the baptism of Jesus after landmines are cleared. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. On January 20th, Joe Biden became the 46th president of the United States. On his first day in office, Biden signed more than a dozen executive orders ranging from new initiatives fighting COVID-19 to rejoining the Paris Climate Accords. George Thomas has a look at some of the key policies he authorized on his first day in office that signal the major changes to expect from this administration.
President Biden's first order of business on his first day on the job was to immediately reverse some of his predecessors' key policies and agendas.
Some of the things we're going to be doing are going to be bold and vital, and there's no time to start like today.
Top of his priority, getting the COVID pandemic under control. Biden's first executive order, signed while wearing a mask, requires face coverings on all federal lands, along with a pledge to deliver 100 million vaccine shots in his first 100 days in office. He plans to sign 10 pandemic-related orders today.
It's requiring, as I said all along, where I have authority, mandating masks be worn, social distancing be kept on federal property, on interstate commerce, etc.
With a stroke of several pens, the incoming president then signed more than a dozen other executive orders, the most a president has ever done on his first day.
An incredibly broad scope of bold and aggressive actions, some of which are designed to roll back some of the most egregious actions of the Trump administration.
Among them, Biden repealed Trump's travel ban, preventing people from predominantly Muslim and African countries from entering the United States. And as part of his campaign promise to re-engage the world, the president rejoined the World Health Organization and the controversial Paris Climate Accords, which President Trump pulled out of. The president also revoked plans for a Keystone XL oil pipeline.
The United States continues to be one of the world's largest emitters of greenhouse gases, and we need to put in place policies and take steps here to address that as well.
Some argue nixing the Keystone Pipeline project and rejoining the Paris Treaty will hurt American workers and further weaken an economy already reeling from COVID.
The reality is regulations that are promulgated on the energy industry are going to increase those prices, which are going to have dramatic ripple effects throughout the economy, disproportionately impacting the lowest income families in America.
The Biden administration plans to sign more executive orders in the weeks ahead, including rolling back restrictions on abortion funding and revoking the ban on transgenders from serving in the military. George Thomas, CBN News.
One of the key architects shaping U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East for nearly 4 years has been U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. CBN News sat down with Ambassador Friedman for his last official interview in the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. Ambassador David Friedman ended his time as ambassador as he began it by praying at the Western Wall.
Ambassador David Friedman.
Friedman feels work accomplished over the past 4 years will help the incoming Biden administration get off to a good start.
Normally, people come into office and the Middle East is all ablaze, and that becomes a challenge. I think that's not the case here. I think we've left the Middle East in a good place. I would urge real caution in changing any of the dynamics. It ain't broke, so don't fix it.
That includes potentially renewing the Iranian nuclear deal. The Trump administration ended the 2015 agreement known as the JCPOA that had been struck by the Obama administration. Are you concerned about the fact that the Biden administration has already said that they want to renegotiate or re-enter the Iranian nuclear deal?
Boy, going back to 2015 would just be an enormous mistake, and it could threaten all the advances that we've made in the region. There really is no rational basis to return to the JCPOA. You know, one of the arguments that kept coming up then in favor of the JCPOA was, if we let Iran back into the community of nations, they will self-modulate, they will self-correct. 5 years later, we know the truth. We know that they didn't self-correct. The idea that we would make a deal with Iran that would give them a path to a bomb is, frankly, insanity.
Friedman also believes such a move could threaten the Abraham Accords, an achievement that took many by surprise, but not Friedman.
The seeds of these relationships have been there for years. They were there under the Obama administration as well. They were there. They needed some water, they needed some fertilizer, they needed some real engagement. But we knew from the beginning that we were onto something.
Ambassador Friedman pointed out what set the Trump administration apart.
What I think I'm most proud of is that our administration really extended to Israel not just the courtesy, but the right to self-determination, to really decide for themselves how to govern. And I hope that courtesy continues to be extended, because that's where I think we really made a difference.
That set the stage for historic moves, such as the United States recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, declaring Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and moving the U.S. Embassy there.
I think the most significant event of the 4 years was moving the embassy to Jerusalem. I think so much came from that. You know, I think when we moved the embassy, when we recognized Jerusalem, I think it just opened up enormous possibilities for the U.S.-Israel relationship, and I think it put America really on the right track.
Friedman also helped change the U.S. approach to Israel's biblical heartland and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
What we did was very much in the best interests of the United States, not just the best interests of Israel. And I think the proof is in the fact that after we moved the embassy and after we recognized sovereignty over the Golan Heights and after we did all the other things that we did, not only was there not an explosion of violence, but there was an explosion of peace. We were able to achieve, once-in-a-generation agreements with Bahrain and the Emirates, Sudan, Morocco, Kosovo, all Muslim countries.
As ambassador, one Bible story inspired Friedman. He kept this painting of the story of the sin of the 10 spies who went into the Promised Land.
The one sin I don't want to commit is the sin of the spies, the sin of not having enough faith or confidence or vision in the relationship between Israel and the United States and the importance of keeping that as strong as possible.
While the new administration hasn't announced the replacement, many experts on both sides agree Ambassador Friedman will be a tough act to follow. Up next, more of our interview with Ambassador David Friedman, where he discusses the Abraham Accords and Israel's biblical heartland. Here's more of our interview with Ambassador Friedman, where he addresses potential dangers to the Abraham Accords and the historic change in U.S. policy towards Israel's biblical heartland. Ambassador Friedman, great to see you again.
Chris, great to be with you again.
Yeah. One thing that you made history was the Abraham Accords. Does the Iranian nuclear deal threaten the Abraham Accords?
Well, it does, because, look, the Abraham Accords were, they're transformational. And of course, they're based on things that go beyond security. They're based on commercial interests and interests of tourism and a warm peace among peoples. But of course, there's also a common enemy, and that was a factor. I mean, all these countries were threatened by Iran. And to elevate that threat could easily cause some of these countries to start retreating into their own national security needs in a way that might make it much more difficult for them to be as open as they are today. So I would hope that the Abraham Accords could survive anything. They're really important, but they're new, and they have to be nurtured. And I do think that the commonality of a common security front against Iran, joined by the United States, is a pillar. It's not the only pillar, but it's one of the pillars upon which these accords rest.
One other thing you made history is you changed the whole paradigm to Israel's biblical heartland, Judea and Samaria. Looking back, how would you express the changes of the U.S. policy toward Judea and Samaria?
Well, look, we brought that policy back to where it belonged. We actually changed it relative to the last 20 years. But if you go back to 1967, when Judea and Samaria became an issue, right? That's when Israel, recaptured the territory from Jordan. There's only one agreement since 1967 that all the litigants, all the conflicting parties agreed to. That was UN Resolution 242. While it's been subject to multiple interpretations, the U.S. interpretation, the one that, because we had our own people, Arthur Goldberg was our negotiator. Our interpretation was that Israel would withdraw from some, but not all of the territories that they captured. Now they withdraw from 85% or more of it between Sinai and Gaza. They've withdrawn from the vast majority of the territory that they captured. Judea and Samaria, if you look at our own interpretation of those days, was that the Jews had a better claim, the Israelis had a better claim to Judea and Samaria than any other competing claim. Sure, there should be a resolution. The parties should try to resolve it, but on the basis of a dispute to territory as to which the Israelis probably had the better claim. That was where we were in 1967. We got completely off track to the point where when we took office, we were coming in on the heels of UN 2334, which the U.S. supported. I mean, they abstained, but effectively they supported it because by abstaining, they enabled it to pass, which was a Security Council resolution that found the entirety of Judea and Samaria, East Jerusalem, the Western Wall, all illegally occupied territory. So we had gone way off track, and our goal was not to make new law. Our goal was to restore, the original intent of the parties, all the parties, when they got together back in 1967 to try to figure out the framework for resolving, the issues that stemmed from the Six-Day War. And I'm convinced that we're in the right place under international law. I'm certainly convinced that we're in the right place under the American view of international law.
One thing that you and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu did was sign an agreement back in October about Ariel University, and where you allowed U.S. investment or funds to go to across the Green Line and support scientific research. How important was that?
It was very important. Look,
is that sort of like a boycott of the U.S. funds that couldn't go to Judea and Samaria?
When I learned that U.S. Research funding, we're talking about something which, by its nature, should be apolitical. Funding, research and science and better understanding. And here you have a university in Ariel, right, which is a major Israeli city. There's no scenario under which Israel would ever relinquish its control of Ariel, nor should it. And you have this university there with 16,000 students, probably at least 1,000 of whom are Palestinian. You have a model for peaceful coexistence in an academic environment among Jews and Arabs, Muslims, Christians. And here the United States is refusing to participate with it in academic research. To me, it was just an unthinkable outcome of these agreements. So yeah, we worked really hard to fix them, and we changed them all. And the United States no longer boycotts, institutions over the Green Line. They never should have, but they don't anymore.
Coming up, part 2 of our interview with Ambassador Friedman, his negotiations with the Palestinian Authority, and his relationship with evangelical Christians. In part 2 of our interview with Ambassador Friedman, he discusses how the Trump administration dealt with the Palestinian Authority and his relationship with evangelical Christians. Going to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, you again made history and changed the whole paradigm. How did you approach that and had the Peace to Prosperity plan that came out last January?
I was asked by a reporter from the New York Times why we were punitive towards the Palestinians. I said, we were never punitive to the Palestinians. He said, well, isn't cutting off funding a punishment? And I said, absolutely not. Our policy towards the Palestinians was we demand a minimal level of accountability. That's it, accountability. The same accountability we would expect from our own people, American citizens, or from the Israeli government. Just accountability. We're giving you money, don't use it to pay terrorists. That sounds like a punishment? How would a U.S. taxpayer dollar ever be used to pay a terrorist? I mean, it's unthinkable. We said, you want to have more autonomy? Well, you have to have religious freedom. You have to have a basic system of human rights. You can't pull people out of their homes who are accused of brokering a sale of a house from an Arab to a Jew. You can't pull them out of their houses and torture them in the middle of the night, which was an experience I had with a dual Palestinian-American citizen. You need to up your game to the point where you are accountable to your own people and you're accountable to your donors. And that to us wasn't punishment. We're going to give money to UNRWA, which creates vile textbooks that foment hatred against Israel, that does absolutely nothing to relieve the suffering of Palestinians, perpetuates their refugee status indefinitely, when every other refugee organization in the world is geared towards resolving, resettling refugees. UNRWA does just the opposite. We're going to fund that? No, because we insist upon minimal accountability to international standards of behavior. That was a major shift of the Trump administration, but it was not intended to be punitive at all. And I think ultimately it will help the Palestinian people because it makes their leadership more accountable to them more than anybody else.
One thing you've done during the past 4 years is work with a lot of Christian evangelical Zionists. Describe that situation, that relationship that has grown over the last 4 years.
Well, it's been a great joy because I didn't really know the community well before I got this job. First of all, the Christian evangelical community is enormously important to the relationship, the U.S.-Israel relationship, because there are far more Christian Zionists in America than there are Jewish Zionists. So just in terms of the democratic process in America, it's great to have so many friends on American soil who believe that it's in the U.S. interests to really support Israel. Separate from that, I really have made so many great friends, people who really, I think really believe in the centrality of Israel, not just to their faith, but to their values. People who share my view. I mean, I'm completely aligned with the Christian community on this, that the values that make America great are the values that came out of Jerusalem, as where we're sitting now. Isaiah says, out of Zion shall go forth the law. The great values, the great principles that informed our founding fathers when they said that in the Declaration of Independence that certain unalienable rights were endowed by our Creator. Well, how do they know that? They knew that by reading the Bible. And where the Bible come from? It came from right here. So I think that, to me, as I see the United States going through a very difficult time, my own view is that we've become too untethered to our foundational values. That's I think we need to reconnect. And I'm not suggesting people, necessarily become deeply religious, although I think that has a real intrinsic value in terms of anyone's personal growth. But just understand, where we came from. We came from a common set of values rooted in the Bible. And the more we can study that and understand that, I think we'll see how, all the things we're fighting over now are relatively trivial. And they ought to be easy to overcome. We ought to be able to come together based upon, the roots of our nation, which again are deeply rooted in the Bible. And I think the Christian evangelical community has a role to play there because they are such a large community, I think deeply respected within the United States.
So Ambassador Friedman, thanks for your time and thanks for being with us on Jerusalem Dateline.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Up next, churches on the Jordan River and close to where Jesus may have been baptized come back to life. Although the pandemic is keeping Christians and others from visiting the Holy Land, Israel is helping local Christians under lockdown celebrate their feast. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl shows us how.
Each year, some 800,000 pilgrims and tourists visited this holy site until COVID-19 hit. But the coronavirus didn't stop Greek Orthodox clergy from celebrating the Epiphany on both sides of the Jordan River.
It's the day, the memory of the baptism of our Jesus Christ in Jordan River by St. John the Baptist.
This is Qasr al-Yahud on the Jordan River. It's the place many believe that Jesus was baptized by John. It's also the place where they believe that the children of Israel crossed over into the Promised Land and where Elijah was carried up to heaven in a chariot.
The ceremony this year is limited because of the coronavirus.
Last year, for example, passed from here more than 15,000 people. And this year it was only 50.
The ceremony started with prayers at the Greek Orthodox St. John the Baptist Monastery. The small band of worshipers then walked the mile-long trek to the Jordan River.
We're doing everything that we can in order to allow the Christian ceremonies at the baptismal site in order to ensure freedom of religion and freedom of worship, and especially to protect the safety and health of the believers.
Israel's side of the baptismal site opened to visitors in 2011, although the 250 acres around it, known as the land of the monasteries, remained off limits until now. 7 churches have property here.
After the 6-day war, this was actually a war zone. And there were a lot of mines that were put in the soil in this area. As you can see, the border between Israel and Jordan is very, very close by.
Sharon Regev from Israel's Foreign Ministry says that allowed terrorists to easily infiltrate and use the monasteries for hiding and as a base to carry out attacks.
For many decades, it was very hard to get into the monasteries to pray and do the worship.
Due to those concerns, authorities blocked access to most places beginning in the 70s.
In recent years, both the Israeli Ministry of Defense, together with the Halo Trust, invested a lot of efforts in removing all these mines and having the worship come back to the land of monasteries.
That allowed the Franciscan Chapel, built in 1956, to hold its first service in 54 years. The land of the monasteries is considered part of the West Bank, but under Israel's security control.
Thank God that the army is responsible and we have a very good communication with them. They help us.
Regev says Israel is committed to freedom of religion and access to the holy sites.
As the only democracy in the Middle East, we would like to be sure that we guarantee full access to all the holy sites and freedom of worship for all the different religions to come here and to worship and to enjoy their faith.
And everyone is hoping for a return of the tourists and pilgrims once the pandemic passes. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Qasr al-Yahud, the Jordan Valley.
Well, hopefully tourists will be able to visit Qasr al-Yahud themselves very soon. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Please remember to pray for the new U.S. administration and for the peace of Jerusalem. And remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time